Hello my friends, and welcome to our Captain Marvel edition of Cheap Tricks. As of this recording, I've only seen the trailer for Captain Marvel, but based on everything that I've seen, the movie uses the heck out of some energy effects. I'm going to show you how to create some exact looks from the Captain Marvel film, but I'm also going to give you a primer on all the effects and tools you need to create some fantastic energy effects for whatever project you're working on. Now, if you want to use After Effects to create any kind of energy effect, it's really important that you know these filters. I'll be the first to tell you that fractal noise is probably the most powerful and versatile effect in After Effects.
Fractal noise is probably the most powerful and versatile effect in After Effects.
What does that guy know? And what is this? Are the 90s the new 80s of pop culture reference? Oh. God, I'm old. Fractal noise is an essential ingredient in creating organic patterns from scratch in After Effects. Now, fractals are never-ending patterns. They're simultaneously simple and also infinitely complex patterns that mathematically repeat over and over again. All this is to say that they're a kind of chaos that you can control. When people look to harness the elemental forces in movies or shows, we've long envisioned them looking like something kind of related to electricity or fire or smoke. Fractal noise looks a little bit like all that, and fractals are the driving force behind a lot of the really cool effects that can create organic patterns and forms. Now, many of you are probably totally familiar with all this, and you can always feel free to use the table of contents below to navigate ahead, but when I jump into my example shots, I'm going to gloss over some of the more repetitive steps. Let's start with fractal noise. I've got a new HD comp with a black solid. You'll find the effect under Noise, Fractal Noise. Now, right up top, there are a variety of looks that might approximate something that you're kind of going for. Some look more like clouds, some more like energy, some swirly, but what they all have in common is that they fill your solid with a very unique looking pattern, which can be controlled by the brightness and contrast values, then transformed, scaled, or offset, and lastly, almost most importantly, it can respond to an evolution dial. Now, as you can see, as I rotate the evolution, I get a wonderful transformation of all these values in a really organic way. Like, check this out. Evolving some dynamic progressive noise with just a little bit of color correction, and you've got a ground plane of lava. A different color palette and turning this on its head, and you get a pretty cool sky. Now, setting keyframes for the offset position and some for the evolution can give you this really pretty result. So even with a bare minimum amount of love put into them, the output is pretty amazing. Now, flattening this back out, we could try some different modes of noise. Maybe inverted, with some thoughtful brightness and contrast applied. We can create some more energy-filled, caustic kind of stuff. Now, you can use offset keyframes like we did with the sky, but my preferred way to animate this fractal noise is with time expressions. I can Alt-Option-click on the property I want and type in time times any value I like. For some reason, I will start out at like 150 and then adjust as needed. You can even use time expressions for things like the offset value, as long as you bracket it and use one value for X and one for Y. I'm actually going to change my noise type to smeary, and then kind of adjust the brightness and contrast again. There we go. Now, if I wanted to tint this baby bluish or something like that, we've got the beginning of something pretty cool. And then if we want, we can add an additional effect to spruce this up even more, a turbulent displace. Now, turbulent displace obviously distorts your image, but it's all on top of a fractal noise pattern. And you can see that there are several similar options up front. There's a few different types of displacement, then the transform settings, and then evolution options. That's sort of the core info you get from any fractal-driven plugin. Now, a nicely scaled turbulent displace can break up any monotony that starts to appear in your fractal noise, and it can make things seem maybe more liquidy as the values are big, and more crackly if your values are low. You could even use multiple instances of turbulent displace, perhaps even making the surface a little crackly and then overlaying a larger distortion. In my experience, it always looks better to use the small distortions first and then apply the larger ones afterward. Now I think at this point I'll mention a stylization that pairs really well with fractal noise. We've used it in Cheap Tricks before. It's our good old friend vector blur. Now, vector blur is actually a really cool tool that's supposed to be used as a control layer to influence and align directions of blurs. But when you apply vector blur without a control layer, the image's own luminance is used to blur and smear the pixels either inward or outward. This can give us a really cool pinching or bubbling effect. Now, it's just a stylization, but it's totally worth knowing about and playing with. Now back to our list, our last featured fractal filter is roughen edges. We've used it before, but here in this context it's a little easier to see that the function of this is really similar to the other fractal plugins. It erodes the edges of your alpha by overlaying various fractals of transparency. Now just like the other filters, you have style options, then the transform tools, and lastly some evolution settings. Now let me do a small demo of how quickly you can combine some of these filters to create a really cool energy effect. Let's start with a new comp. We'll add a solid that I'll call energy. And here I'll draw a mask and create a relatively simple shape. Then I can add a few keyframes to create a basic animation. So we've got this basic thing right here. And I'll pause on a frame in the middle like this, and I'm going to add roughen edges to this. I'm going to use the spiky version, and then turn it up until I can start to see the borders of this thing making really cool shapes. Then I can add some fractal noise to this. I'll just push and pull a few values until I get something kind of interesting. Next, I'll add turbulent displace to add some cool bend and twist to the shape. Something like that. And then I'll add an instance of vector blur, turned up just a little bit to kind of pinch those values into sharper peaks. CC toner is a quick way to choose a color scheme for this energy. And then lastly, I can add a glow to this energy. Or I can do the Kramerian special, which is 2 instances of glow, one narrow, one wide. And it's looking cooler already. Watch. Now this is kind of the bare minimum we can do. And as you can see, these filters are turning this boring old shape into this interesting one. This means you barely have to put any effort into the initial shape to get a pretty cool output. Now let me pull in a background file to show you something fun we can do. Now right now this shape has some black values from the fractal noise, so I can change the blending mode to add, and I can see it nicely on top. I could also try and unmult if I really need the alpha preserved. Now I'm happy with this little crackle of energy, but if I go to the background layer, I can add a displacement map and tell it to reference the energy layer's effects and masks, and then create a distortion effect that's based on that energy ripple. And now we've got an effect that's pretty cool. Now, nearly every effect I do today will springboard off of some of these principles, and the notion that it's best to get the simplest effects working in your favor. Alright, everyone doing well? Great. Let's start with the Captain Marvel full body look. Now, every shot like this needs to start with some footage of your hero character. Use whatever resources you have available to shoot some footage of your friend in front of a keyable surface. I had the help of an amazing crew in the UK who filmed this wonderful footage for me. And just so you know, it really helps if the newest member of your team happens to be a lightsaber-wielding motion capture artist from the British Academy of Dramatic Combat, who already happens to have a Captain Marvel suit. Everyone, meet Marta Svatek, Red Giant's bloody brilliant new community manager. Now, I'll let you in on a little secret of mine. I'm red-green colorblind. Those two colors look a lot alike to me, so I'm obviously in the right profession. And while keying out blowing blonde hair in front of a green screen is really one of my favorite things to do, it really helps when you have the right keying tools as well. So I'm going to apply Primat Keyer, which allows me to select the background color, and then after that I can shuttle back and forth between the clean background and clean foreground options, allowing me to visually paint away the sections of the green screen that I don't want, and also draw in detail for the sections that I do. As I work, I can go down to the toggle in the comp window to switch to just the alpha channel to see what my result is looking like, and if there are any obvious spots that I might have missed. Under the correction tab, I can select the shrink matte just a hair to choke away some of those floating points, and then defocus my matte result a little bit. Also, Primatte comes with this built-in spill killer, which I can set to green, and it can help me recover things like this green kind of reflected in the gold bits of her costume. I'll go ahead and matte out this section of footage, and then we're pretty much ready to go. Next, for these shots, I'll need some kind of spaceship-y background. So I purchased a 3D model of this sci-fi door from Sketchfab, made by CG Wolf, and then I lit and rendered it in After Effects using Element 3D. My simple goal here was just to create 2 still frames for you guys. One pretty tame, and then one with some bright underlighting. Now the cool thing about this is you can throw these 2 images, the unlit and the lit layer, on top of each other. And then if I add a wiggle expression to the opacity of the lit one, the result is this really lightweight backdrop with some interesting lighting going on. So now we've got a source character and a background, and I can finally start putting together my first shot procedurally. Now I'm creating this whole shot with an eye toward it becoming an easy-to-use template that you guys can pick up and start using pretty immediately. So to do that, I'm going to try breaking down what Captain Marvel's high energy state looks like. Now, I've only got a few shots to go off of from the trailer, but I feel like I get the idea. We've got those hot edge glows. To do this, I'll duplicate my source layer, and then generate a fill inside the back copy. A bright pale yellow color. I'll set the blending mode to add, and then I'll add some turbulent displace. I can add a time expression to the evolution. And so now as I play through, you can see different bits of her outline kind of revealed as the displace pushes it one way or the other. I'll adjust the size and amount until I'm getting just a nice bit of organic bleed here and there. And adding a fast box blur at the end makes it more of a glow. Moving on, let's create some of those hot bits of energy that kind of wrap around her edges onto her front side. I'll duplicate my hot edge glow, because it has a lot of properties I already like, but I'll move it above the source layer. I'll add a simple choker effect that I place up here above the turbulent displace. If I choose a negative value, it'll kind of bloat the image a little bit. Now, I can apply the set matte effect. Now, by checking invert matte and moving this up above my turbulent displace, I've effectively punched out the center of this layer and created a warbled edge. If I apply the roughen edges effect to this and choose the spiky edge type, I can dial that up, add an expression to the evolution, and a few settings later, I've got a really cool result. Now right now it looks kind of graphic or cartoony, and this effect shouldn't really extend that far outside of her. So if I apply a second set matte effect, it'll preserve only these interior heat lines. I'll add an instance of vector blur and turn it up slightly to give these more of a fluid feel. And then I play with moving my turbulent displace a little lower in the stack, so this energy sometimes gets to go a little outside the lines, but not as far as before. Excellent. Now to create a simple bit of inner glow or light wrap, I'm going to use a really simple technique. I'll create a yellow solid, I'll add the set matte effect, and then select that source layer for the alpha channel. Then I check the invert matte box and add a fast box blur to these yellow pixels so they'll bleed over her a little bit. Then if I add a second set matte effect choosing the same source layer, but this time I don't invert the matte, the result is a really simple inner glow whose radius is determined by that fast box blur. And I really like the way that helps soften the edges. Let's move on to the cold energy details. I'll create another copy of my source layer, and then I'll add the Stylize Find Edges effect. There's an option to invert, which I'll check, and then I can set my blending mode to add. Now, if I use some CC toner, I can colorize this a little bit more like electricity. Now, what I'm ultimately interested in is turning these edges into some electric pulses that kind of move along her suit's outlines. I can turn these smoother looking lines into something that looks a little bit more like electricity by combining a couple instances of turbulent displace together. But it looks really corny when it's totally filling in all of these lines, and I have an idea of how to fix that. Let me turn off these modifiers for a second so you can see what I'm clearly doing. I'm going to add a fractal noise effect right after my find edges effect. If I crank up the contrast a bunch, you'll get some nice black and white patches. Fractal noise has a blending mode setting at the very bottom, which allows me to multiply these black patches over the find edges effect, making it so you can only see the areas in the white. Now watch as I rotate the evolution value, and you can see what appears to be glowing bits dancing along the edges of these outlines. I can use a time expression to automate this evolution, and then turn on my other effects again. Playing through this effect soloed shows you that now I have something that looks a lot like electricity dancing along the contours of the image. And no joke, it might be really useful to use just this layer's effects as a way to procedurally generate electricity on top of any kind of footage you wanted, and get a pretty decent result. Moving on, let's create some of that blue energy fill with a new solid layer. I'll add some fractal noise, choose dynamic progressive, and then check invert. I'll play with the brightness and contrast a bit, and then I'll add an expression, like always, to the evolution. I'd like to create the illusion of this noise having some puffed depth, so it's not just a flat layer on top of her. So I add an instance of CC glass, and then select that original source layer and use its alpha to kind of puff up the center of her shape. Now below that I also have a set matte set to that same source layer to clip it properly. After that I'll actually duplicate my CC glass instance and switch the property to luminance. If I turn down the values, I can get some nice distortions around the contours of the original footage, just for some more detail. CC toner helps me blue this up a bit. Then I'll use a similar trick to my electricity layer, where I'll add some fractal noise that multiplies through this effect. And I'll add some expressions to its evolution, and then some to the offset, which, if I set like this, makes the noise pattern drift upward over time. I'll make sure my fractal noise is multiplying on top of the other effects, and then I'll set the blending mode of this whole layer to add. And I'll slightly adjust the brightness and contrast of the original fractal noise to about there. And then, just like before, I'll add a vector blur, just enough to make this energy look a little bit more like caustic webs of energy. Now, playing through this all, it's looking pretty awesome. One issue that I've ignored so far are the bits of energy that are in front of her face, but I have a nifty solve for that. I'll create a new solid, which I'll call Face Blocker, and I'll create a little feathered mask where her face is. Now this layer can be set as a guide layer, and its opacity can be turned all the way down. The reason I have it is because now I can select any layer in the foreground causing these issues and apply a set matte effect to them. In the effect, I can select the face blocker layer and choose masks, then check invert matte. Now I can rename this effect face block matte, so I remember what it is. And then I can copy the effect, select all the layers in the foreground, and then paste it. And now her face is preserved across all of these layers, and I have this handy top layer that allows me to select any area I don't want covered in energy, and I can adjust the feather or finely tune that look as I need. Now before we go any further, I've been doing all of this stuff on top of the flat footage, but it could use a little more zing. I'll add a top adjustment layer, and then add magic bullet looks. You've seen me use this before, and especially with this flat footage, you can get some truly incredible results really quickly. Once I'm back outside, I'm going to add two glows, one narrow and one wide, so I get a nice bloom around the highlights. After that, I'm going to apply a couple of effects from Red Giant Universe. Now, I'll admit that I've always had a little bit of trouble remembering and finding some of the effects included with Universe, but the latest update has totally solved that problem for me. Simply go to Window, Extensions, where you can click on the Red Giant Universe dashboard. Here you can quickly preview all of the many effects and presets within them. Right now I'm looking for some glow effects to match those glimmers from the trailer, and there's an effect called Glimmer right here. Clicking on it gives me some nice presets to choose from and get started. I'll apply this Anamorph one, and then I can make some individual tweaks in my effects window. Next, I can pull up that dashboard again and go to Distort, and then select maybe my favorite of all the Universe filters, Heat Wave. I'll apply the Billowed preset, and I'll tweak a few settings, and also go to the built-in mask options, where I'll select an ellipse, invert it, and then use these two control points to make a nice area around the face where there's no heat distortion. Now, I like how this is looking so far, and I skipped one of the exterior effects earlier. I'll call them auras. They probably have a name in the comics, Becky's or something, but they basically look like little stripes of energy that flow off of Captain Marvel. I'll duplicate my source layer, and I'll use two effects to kind of create these little energy wisps. First is a radial fast blur, which will smear my image outward. If I drag it down here, it kind of looks like it's shooting upward. And then I'll apply Colorama. Now, Colorama takes the input of the original image and converts it to an output cycle of custom colors. Play around with it for just a little bit and you'll see exactly what I mean. One of the most versatile effects this thing does is it allows you to repeat the output cycle, meaning that you can create an even more complex color image based on what you feed it. Something wild like this, for example. Now, if I were to animate the phase shift, I get colors that generally move in the direction of the intensity of the original image. Now just watch this to see what I mean. Kinda nice and flowy, and combined with that radial fast blur, it looks really cool, kind of Aurora Borealis style. To complete their look, I'll use CC Toner to color them like I have before, and then I'll add an instance of CC Glass, and use the original image's alpha channel to warp the shape of these auras. Adding a little bit of turbulent displace afterward makes them look even more varied. I'll duplicate that and make a hot and a cold copy. I'll add some time expressions and some variants so these two layers have a different resulting hot and cold set of wisps. And they look pretty cool. Now I feel like some steam or smoke coming from the floor might be a nice little detail to add some more life to this comp. So in a fresh comp, I used 3 instances of fractal noise combined with some roughened edges, all kind of overlaying and warped to look like rising mist. Like I said, man, fractal noise, awesome. Now throwing that in the background and tinting it looks pretty nifty in here. Now Captain Marvel looks to have some of these cool blue flurries coming off her fists. They actually look a lot like this screensaver, and are simple enough to replicate with Trapcode Particular, which I love so much, why don't I marry it? I'm pre-rendering a loopable video file of this effect, and then bringing it in so I can scale and place it over her fists. As far as tracking, it's worth doing as few keyframes as you can get away with. Next, let's look at the eyes. Now glowing eyes are relatively simple. You'll need to track the location of your eyes or pupils, and you could do that manually with a simple point tracker, or you can try it this way. Draw a loose mask around the face in the footage layer, and then right-click on that mask in the timeline, and say Track Mask. Over in the tracking window, you can select Face Tracking, Detailed Features. Now you can track forward from the start frame of your comp, and it takes a little while, but it usually does a pretty decent job. It's basically creating an effect with the point information of all of these details of the face. All this data does bloat your file size, so it's worth deleting any of the extra keyframes you don't need by clicking their stopwatches off. Now, I shuffled some things around and I won't go into too much detail here, but effectively what I did next was use that tracking data to help position two no light factory lens flares. I'm using a preset that I saved for Captain Marvel's eyes, and then pick whip the light location to the position of one of the pupils. And I'm going to duplicate the effect, but modify the expression so that I have a right and left pupil being rendered. By pressing the tilde key, I can maximize my timeline so I can see a little bit better, and then quickly link the brightness and scale of these two lens flares together. I'll press tilde again, and things are back to normal. And a side note, the tilde key will maximize any panel you're working on in After Effects, so I could maximize my comp to preview it for a second, or my timeline when I'm working with a lot of expressions, or whatever else you want. And then just press tilde a second time to go back to your previous arrangement. Blah blah blah, I scaled the lens flares to match the eye size, and then add some keyframes for the eyes to start out really bright and then dim over time. I'll even add some opacity fall off for the layer itself right at the end, just to smooth this fade a little bit. I'll drag this eyes layer up above my global glow adjustment layer so they don't get too blown out. Then I'll add an additional black solid with another instance of no light factory, with a really bright flare coming right off of her core that fades out over time. On top of this all, I can add another adjustment layer with Universe Camera Shake. I'll use the car mount preset and dial down the values so I get just a little bit of camera rumble throughout the shot. I really like the way this turned out, and I want to be able to save some of the work that we've done. So after I finished this comp, I went through with the pseudo effect maker to create one set of controls that can influence all of these layers below. So basically here's how it works. We've got one comp for your source, your green screen character. Then we've got two for this background included for you guys. I'll recommend a dark background for this because the glows can get a little bit overwhelming if your background is bright. And then here we've got comp 3, the resulting effect. Everything in here is labeled pretty clearly for what it does. There are some hidden layers that are locked down here, which you can unlock if you want to mess with, but I would just leave them. But right up top we've got the Marvelous controls, which include the speed, which is basically how fast everything flows around. We've got energy level, which can be dialed all the way up to 100, a little crazy, and back down to 0. We've got the glow opacity, which is basically just the opacity of that top level glow. Then we've got scale. Scale will obviously affect all of the sizes of the fractal noises and patterns. So let me do a bad example. Now this noise would look probably too small for a close-up, so you can scale it up right here. Then you've got that face masker, which is the thing that blocks out the interior details, so you can have like a clear face or something like that. Let me just reset everything really quickly. Below what's open up already, we have some advanced controls and other options. We've got checkboxes for all the different types of energy that are being rendered. So you could turn off the cold energy or the hot energy, or have them both on but leave the auras off, things like that. And then under the advanced controls, we have individual controls to tone down the cold, tone down the hot if you want, and also to play with the aura's opacity and length. Now, there's one more really cool feature that I like about this that I had some help from the Creative Cow community coming up with. Now, my source layer is going to be different than your source layer, but if it contains a face, what you can do is select it, draw a mask around the face, you can set it to none, but if you run the face tracking in detailed feature mode, automatically adds in Captain Marvel's eyes. I had some help from Oleg Pirogov to come up with the script that makes this work. All of the eye settings are in this eyes layer, and they basically come with some master controls for the scale, brightness, and one more feature I think you'll find helpful, the right and left nudge. The code here is trying to find that pupil position value from your face tracker that you run. Now that can end up a little bit off, but I find that usually it's a pretty consistent value across them all, and you can set some light keyframes to keep them right on the eyes. In overend footage, we've also got this fist flurry, which you can bring in, set to an additive mode. And I'd recommend using the pan behind to move its anchor point right down to here. That way, once you get it positioned, it's easy to scale. Alright, let's try our template out on this close-up here. I've got it pre-keyed and put it into my source comp. I'm going to jump to the background comp, and I'm going to maybe scale up this background a bit, just so it's kind of a different type of thing back here. There we go. And let's go ahead and see what our effect turned out like. Ooh, interesting. I'm going to go ahead and add some keyframes to this face mask. Try to preserve her face a little bit. Her hair is crazy bright. So I'm going to go to the Marvelous controls up here. I'm going to see if I turn the energy down, what happens. There we go, that looks kind of better. And maybe I can turn down the hot opacity a bit too. Yeah, that looks a little bit less extreme. I'm also going to adjust the size since she's more of a close-up scale. Say around here. I kind of like the size of those lightning bits. I really feel like somewhere in here is actually a pretty cool look. I'm going to solo the eyes layer and my source layer. Then, around my last frame, I'm going to draw a mask on my source, set it to none, and then over here in the tracker, I'm going to use face tracking, detailed features, and run this backwards. Now check that out. Right as soon as it starts running, those eyes start glowing. Now her face tilts pretty far down, but it looks like it's tracking it pretty nicely. Just like last time, I'm going to quickly press U to reveal all the keyframes on this layer. It created a lot, obviously. I'm going to highlight and delete anything that isn't one of these pupils. And I actually don't even need this mask anymore. But check it out, we've got glowing eyes pretty automatically. Now, right at the end, I want her eyes to be a little bit brighter. So let's turn the brightness up. Let's try adjusting the scale up a little bit. Yeah, something like that. Then I'm going to scroll back to the point where her eyes kind of transition from looking down to looking up. And right around here, I'm going to set a keyframe for the brightness at 0. Actually, looks like the transition is right around here. Eyes down. Hit F9 to ease that keyframe. Ooh, look at that. And I like it a lot. I'm going to go to full res and I'm going to add some keyframes on my nudges. I scrub through and add a few nudge keyframes just so everything seems perfectly aligned all the way through her look up. And now let's turn everything back on here. For a pretty quick first pass of this shot, I'm really liking it. Let's see what more we could do with it, though. Her hair still seems a little bit too extreme, so I'm going to go to the advanced glow controls and turn the threshold up a little bit. Then I'm going to go to my layer with looks, and I'm going to edit that a little bit. I feel like this curve could be making everything a little bit darker and broodier, especially since there are some glows on top of this. Let's see right around there. Oh, that's nice. I like some of the detail that came back with that pass. While I'm on this layer, I'll also check on heat wave. By default, it leaves an ellipse right at the kind of top center of screen, but it could actually be lower in the case of this close-up, just to keep her face a little bit cleaner. Maybe I'll keyframe the energy up from the beginning to the end, just to make it a little more exciting. Let's see what happens if we enable the core null, but move it out of frame, just to create some streaks of light that flicker along. I can even duplicate the null effect. Move one down here. I might throw these down below the looks layer. Tapping E twice reveals their expressions. Let's turn up how much they flicker. Woo, that's intense. Alright, let's tone down those expressions just a little bit. Then I think it would be nice to go to my looks layer again and kind of up the vignette amount. So I'll go Edit, choose the lens vignette, choke that in a little bit. Yeah. And now let's quickly scrub through a couple parts of this. I think it's pretty great. Let's render it. Alright, next up we got what I thought was one of the most eye-catching parts of the trailer. Seems to be her stopping an explosion with a force field and kind of feeling that energy. To do this, we're going to create our own shockwave asset, and then we're going to comp it all together. Alright, let's create a new composition. Add a solid. Then I'm going to call over the neglected child of the trapcode family. That would be Dow. Now instead of particles, Dow actually creates a geometry. If I add a new camera, you can see that just like the other trapcode plugins, it's a 3D object that I can work with. So, up here we have a path generator. It's automatically generating a circle, which is the shape that I happen to need. Let me see, I'll scale it down a bit, something like that. Then I'll go to segment, which has all the properties of this extruded n-gon. So I'm going to increase the number of repetitions of this shape to a pretty high degree, so it's nice and smooth looking. I'm also going to increase the number of sides until it's looking pretty smooth as well. That looks great. Now, as you guys might have guessed, there is a fractal displacement setting in here, and I'm excited about it because as I turn up this value, you can see the shape being distorted. And it's being distorted in real 3D, which is fantastic. This is an actual object I can fly around. So we'll play with about that much disturbance, but we're going to really increase the frequency of this fractal pattern until we have this nice tangled web. Now it doesn't look like much now, but if I come down here to the shader options, I can tell it to use a density shader. I'm going to disable the ambient occlusion, and I'm going to change the blending mode to add. And now we're getting some kind of smoky, interesting looking shapes. Now Dow can actually react to 3D lights. So if I were to create a white point light, and then I'll position it right in the center of everything. Let me switch to another angle so I can show you. In Dow's lighting settings, I'm going to go to the light fall off and choose smooth. That means that as this light approaches it, there's some actual lighting fall off based on where the light is. I'll turn up its intensity a bit, and then I'll search for the sweet spot where this light is basically illuminating the front edge of this ring, but you get some fall off on the sides, which is pretty cool. Now if I want, I can go to my fractal displacement settings and add an expression for the evolution. Let's try time times 25. Ooh. Ah. It's a pretty, boiling, 3D fractal shape. And because I like its relationship to the light in here, I'm actually going to add some position keyframes to the camera. I'm going to pull it way back until this is pretty small, and then I'm going to push it straight through my loop. Now this is kind of a strange way to have this shape grow over time, but I kind of like it. I'm going to turn this into an ease in keyframe and then reveal the velocity curve, where I'll let it slow down a lot at the end and start off with kind of a bang. Now let me play this animation through. Neat. I've got some of the basics for a fractal shockwave. Now I can do some fun things like increase the speed of this evolution, maybe to 50, and I could set some keyframes on the amplitude, have it start off like this, and then as we get closer to camera, have everything kind of spread out. Let's see what that looks like. Kind of nifty. Now just like with fractal noise, you can add things like vector blur to this, and start to get some pretty cool energy ripple shapes. After playing with this comp a while, I ended up duplicating my instances of DAO and doing some different things to them, adding different amplitudes, some different levels of vector blur, and one just clean level on top. I also animated my light to slowly pull away from it so it darkens over time. And once again, the animation is mostly created by this camera zooming straight into it. So let me play this back. And one of the craziest things about this is that it's an actual 3D shape. So using DAO to create an effect like this means you can use it in a variety of different angles and situations. Now rendering this comp as an asset, I was able to create a separate comp which duplicates that layer a bunch of times, adding it over itself at slightly different timings and different scales. At the end of that, I get to render this really cool shockwave asset I can use. So let's move into the shot. I've got my new green screen clip. I'm going to apply Primat Keyer and then select the background and try to restore some of the foreground details. Do the same process I've been doing before. Once I'm pretty happy with my key, I go ahead and I draw a garbage mat around Marta. Once this is feeling about right, I bring in my kind of temp, doesn't really matter background. It's kind of a nice image of a dirty old airplane, kind of matches the flight suit. I'm going to blur it slightly, and it's only going to be visible for a couple of frames. The trailer and Marta's footage are actually wider than HD, so I'm going to bring in some black bars so I can kind of work with the anamorphic ratio. This means I can scale Marta down in her comp since she doesn't need to go this low in the frame. Next, I need a quick explosion, so I'm turning to my friends at Action VFX, who have provided this amazing explosion. It's got a pretty fantastic alpha channel, and it can go right into my comp. I'll kind of size and position it here, and try to retime everything so Marta is reacting to that explosion at the right time. Once that's in place, I can bring in my pre-rendered shockwave. I'll set the blending mode to add, and then I'll scale it up and try to position it to work nicely in concert with that explosion. Adding some CC toner, I can change it to a nice electric blue color. Then I can create an adjustment layer and place it below my fractal blast layer. I'll add some brightness and contrast to this, and as the explosion sets off, I'll darken the background a lot. They seem to do it in the trailer. Also, as with all energy effects, it's really nicer to comp them over a darker background than a bright background. That's my main guess for why they're doing this. Same reason it's hard to have a lightsaber fight out in the daylight. Already this is starting to look pretty cool. I'm going to grab everything except for my foreground layer and pre-compose them and call it the background. This way I have a foreground and a background layer, and if I want to use an effect like a color matcher, I can reference the background and get all of that color information. I'm going to jump over to my background comp and copy out one of the Fractal Blast layers. I'll paste it into my comp, where I'll kind of arrange it like this, and then draw a small mask. This feathered mask gives me just this small little bit of energy. And if I rotate and position it a little bit like this, it'll look like some of that energy is wrapping around Marta as the explosion continues. Then I can duplicate that layer and kind of rotate it around and place it to her other side, and maybe some above and below her arms, just to feel like that energy is enveloping her as it expands. Next, on our foreground layer, I'll add some light wrap. I can select the background layer and then add a few keyframes throughout just so you can see the explosion kind of impacting her layer and later on that energy. Because this blue energy is on top of the kind of yellow-reddish explosion, it's getting a little bit purpley toward the end, I suspect. So I'm going to add a top adjustment layer with color balance on it and turn down the red highlights a bit as the explosion happens. I'm realizing now that I haven't done any color correction on my flat footage, so I'm going to jump into the keyed comp and apply Colorista. Here I'll scroll down to the lookup table and choose Prolost Flat, which looks pretty nice to me. The background I chose is a little bit boring, and it's nice that that LUT adds a lot more detail to her hair and clothes. Next, to sweeten this a little bit, I'm going to add a black solid and throw on Null Light Factory. I'll pick a light with a pretty small profile, hide a few little bits of it, and then I'll keyframe these small blooms, one under her arm on this side. I'll duplicate the effect, then put another on the other side of her hip, and that adds some nice bloom on top of everything. Jumping into my background comp, I'm going to select one of the energy layers and pre-compose it. Pre-composing it will maintain its scale and position within that comp, but it'll also allow me to do something else. I'm creating a duplicate of this pre-comp also, called Pre-Comped Shockwave Bump. Inside here, I'm going to create a solid, a gray solid, specifically exactly 50% gray. I'll drag it under my shockwave, and then when I come back to my background file, I can throw that bump map to the very bottom and turn it off. Then, on that adjustment layer in there, I can add Universe Prism Displacement and select the pre-comped shockwave as my bump map. This prism displacement is the same one I used in the Wrinkle in Time episode. It's really nice, and I really like the way the colors start to separate the more they get distorted. Playing around with the softness and distortion settings can give me some really cool results. And I kind of like where this has landed. I'm going to go back to my Light Factory layer, and I'm going to add one more right up here next to the side of her face. Here I can select the foreground layer as an obscuration layer, meaning that it'll actually obscure that lens flare in case any of her hair kind of blows in front of it a bit. Over in my background comp, I'm going to find that adjustment layer with the brightness and contrast and turn it down even more. I feel like they go pretty extreme with the explosion in the movie. Jumping back, it's looking pretty great. A last little bit of detail, I'll add a solid with particular. I'll jump into the designer window and choose the explode emitter behavior. I'll crank that up a bit until I have a handful of particles exploding off of it. Then in the particle type, I'll select Sprite, and from the Choose Sprite category, I'm going to choose the glass bit sequence. It's under Dust and Debris. I'll have it choose a random still frame so they all look a little bit different, and I'm going to size these up just a little bit. Something like that. Back in the comp, I'm going to reposition my emitter and then slide that layer to down below my foreground. I'll enable the motion blur on these particles, and I'll also add a color matcher so they kind of blend in nicely with that explosion. I added some universe camera shake and renoiser to make everything feel a little bit more real. And here's the final result.
Check that door for heat, Tim.
Ah, sorry, that was the wrong sound. Can someone give me a hand? I'm so sorry for that. By now, hopefully I've ruined the mystique of any shot that looked beautiful to you once, but now you know is really just a bunch of soulless fractals. I mean, nothing in the shot should really be a mystery to you at this point, so I'm going to go over this very quickly. I've got a cell pattern, vector blurred it, turbulent displaced it, and even multiplied this fractal noise over it. Then, naturally, I masked off little bits and pasted them all over my footage. Heck, I'll even put the whole stinking card in there and camera blur it into some hexagons. Color correct it within an inch of its life. And you know I'm putting some particles in there. Oh, and did someone order a gradient ramp? A duplicate of the hand with some fractal noise and CC glass tinted orange might pass as an interior glow. And if you happen to find any edges while you're out there, you can always tint them blue and wrinkle them up. I'm being a little bit blunt on purpose. I think these energy effects are actually turning out pretty darn well. But it's my business to break this stuff down. And sometimes something you might think is difficult is actually just a good old-fashioned recipe with some simple ingredients. Alright, I hope you guys are having a blast. If not, ouch. And don't worry, I've got a cool template for you. So, confession time. There's this site that gives away all these templates. So when no one's looking, I want to create the look of Captain Marvel's energy blasty thingies.
That's a photon blast.
Okay, a photon blast. Well, there's one piece of green screen footage that I really wanted to make some use of, so I improvised something that I thought would be cooler in the end. But really, I just wanted a passable background to test some of my lasers in front of.
That's a photon blast.
Whatever. The camera's moving in this clip, so we're going to need to track the footage. So this segment failed the initial camera track, so I'm going to feed the camera tracker a modified version of this footage. I'll do a temporary key on my actor so I can erase her and then fill her in with green. And then I'll boost the brightness and contrast of everything just to make sure there's some variance in the background. I can even throw in an instance of colorama and repeat the output cycle. In cases where you have very little contrast in the background, cycling the output phase can effectively create these more distinct shapes for the camera tracker to work with. It's not an exact science, but it worked really well in this instance. Now that we've got a keyed character layer and a tracked camera, I'm going to do a really quick breakdown of the scene, because the comp itself is not stellar, but it did come together pretty quickly. Since there's effectively no depth in the camera solve, it made it easy for me to just throw in this rocky background and have it track with the footage pretty well. Since it was a little bit boring like this, I added an instance of CC slant and set the base point way down here where she makes contact. This allowed me to add some keyframes, creating a low-rent, subtle camera drift. I have a handful of color correction things going on with my keyed footage, but one cool filter I'd love to show you guys is the RG shadow effect. It's really great for creating cast shadows from flat layers. So you basically use these 2 points to establish a ground plane, and this other one is the direction of the shadow. And with just a few keyframes, I have a nice kind of contact shadow going on with her. And all of this only needed to look okay, because I knew I was going to use some ground fog to obscure the contact point and also add some more life to the scene. I was going to reach for some stock video of fog, but then I thought, I've been blabbing about how cool fractals are the whole time, why not just make some? So I created a solid full of fractal noise with some turbulent displace, and then I masked it into this little shape here, using the feather control point options on the mask, which is something I just learned about last year. This created a neat wispy shape. I duplicated the noise layer and created a few different variations of it, and then to make it more versatile, I added a control layer up top, with a wind direction and wind speed controls, which I linked via expressions to all the fractal noise properties below. Setting the speed real low is great for wispy atmospherics, and setting it higher can look more like steam coming off a pot or blowing sand or something. Either way, it's really lightweight and fast, and I'll make sure this template's available to you along with these other files. For this particular comp, I set my wind to be a little bit faster and kind of pointed it up and to the right. Then I made a dozen tinted copies all over my landscape. I hit them with some comp lights to create a bit more depth, and then keyed in some bright flicker to these foreground pieces, just for that moment that I add in the photon blasts. Then I've got a 3D vignette to kind of darken the front corner of the comp here, and a light blue gradient ramp that kind of goes across like this. Then I added some instances of No Light Factory just to JJ this up a little bit here and there. And then right up top I had some adjustment layers with a trifecta of Universe Heatwave, Chromatic Aberration, and Magic Bullet looks. And it's fine. It's fine. This comp isn't my favorite. It looks kind of like if you set an Evanescence video in the third act of Wonder Woman. I haven't even seen Captain Marvel, so I don't even know what this is supposed to be. It's just a fine background plate for my laser template.
Photon Blast.
This is the Captain Marvel Photon Blast template. By default, it features 2 blasts coming from these 2 origin nulls and heading out in the direction of these 2 direction nulls. There's a camera in this comp. The camera is really helpful for getting different perspectives and kind of moving the blast into the right position and scale. But more specifically, you can move the origin and direction nulls to help determine where the blasts are coming from and which direction they're headed out in. Now by default, the template features these 2 arm blasts. There are some hidden lights down here that are used as light emitters for these trap code layers. If you want to just feature 1 blast at a time, you can go to cannon number 2, turn its intensity to 0, and switch it off. And now you've got just 1 origin and 1 direction to play with. Now to make this effect work, I did have some keyframes in these layers below. The one that controls things the very most are the keyframes on the trap code blasts for the particle amount. It's set as a default to come in with 18 particles per second, and then it switches off after a moment. The easiest way to position this blast within your comp is just to grab these small layers and move them to the timing of where you want your laser blast to start. Then you can set the origin and direction as your shot dictates. Alright, so let's try this with a shot. I'm going to bring in that piece of footage we made earlier and drag it to the very bottom here. Perfect, and we're done. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this frame as a guide. I'm going to use the camera's properties to kind of come up with the right scale for these arm blasts before I start keyframing my direction and origin nulls. I like being right around here. Now I'm going to scrub through my footage to find the first spot where she's supposed to be firing, right about here. And I'm going to drag these layers over, just like that. And let's move a little bit in so I can see the vector of these 2 arm blasts. Perfect. If I reveal the position of all of these by pressing P, I can add some keyframes. Now let's go ahead and position our origin nulls. Let's put them here, and we'll put the direction nulls in a direction that it feels like the arm blasts are kind of in alignment with them. And next I just step through and kind of keyframe these origin points and these direction vectors to look correct compared to her arms. Very few keyframes, all things considered. And let's play that through. If I were going to final this shot, I'd probably add an adjustment layer with an instance of Universe Camera Shake, keyframing the master amount to correlate with that photon blast. I'd add some renoiser, and I might even throw in some anamorphic bars and add a transform effect with some keyframed position. It's totally the film student's pan and scan. And hopefully if you've learned anything from today, you know that you could do something like add some energy cuffs to transition from her arm into these laser blasts using something really simple, like a few masks with some roughen edges, maybe some radial fast blur, and some vector blur, to create these simple electrical transitions from her arms into the blasts. Man, there's so much more that could be explored when it comes to these crazy fractals. I honestly gave Fractal Noise a shot for the first time 13 years ago, after seeing this video by this guy. Now I can't imagine my life without it. Honestly, just give yourself like 10 minutes with these plugins and you'll probably impress yourself. I'm going to share a starter file with you that has a few of our fractal creations for inspiration, and also a few pre-rendered elements like this shockwave and these tendrils. And of course, these marvelous templates. A big thanks to our amazing 100,000 YouTube subscribers. We're going to keep creating great tools and content right here, so subscribe below if you haven't, And always feel free to reach out to us on Twitter at Red Giant News, or me personally at Action Movie Kid whenever you have questions, or even better when you want to share something creative you've made. Tell you what, just go film your son or daughter in front of a green screen and turn them into a superhero. They'll love it, and you'll be like the coolest parent around. I mean, the work's done. Just download the thing. It's right there. You know you wanna.